donne la parole maintenant à Andrew HOUCK du CREA de Paris Nanterre, un régional de l'étape, comme on dit sur le Tour de France. Donc il va présenter une communication intitulée No More White Supremacy, le déboulonnage des monuments confédérés à l'épreuve de Black Lives Matter.
Okay, so I'm going to switch to English now. So, the title of my presentation is No More White Supremacy, the Reckoning of Confederate Monuments in the Era of Black Lives Matter. 26 years ago, in 1996, I was finishing high school and was somewhat of a history buff, entranced by the Civil War as part of a generation shaped, at least in part, by Ken Burns's magnificent documentary series of the same name. My friends and I were Civil War reenactors from Indiana, and while we had uniforms to portray both sides, of course, it was more fun to play Confederates. We didn't get into the deeper questions of secession or slavery. We all just knew that the South, because after all Southerners were Confederates, right? Spoiler, they were not. Had led a noble fight, one of defense of their homes from the nasty Yankee invaders. So, back to 1996. My best friend, with whom I reenacted and shared my passion for the Civil War, and I took a spring break trip to Virginia to visit the many battlefields of the Eastern Theater of the war.
The culmination of our voyage was what we saw as something of a pilgrimage, to see the grandiose Robert E. Lee statue in Richmond. And that's exactly what we did. Parking was terrible, so we double parked, and both hopped out quickly and snapped a couple of pictures of the monument from the side. There was too much traffic to get a better shot. As we were getting back in the car, a group of young African-American men approached us, angry. They demanded to know why we took the pictures, eventually being assuaged by what I imagine was our deer-in-the-headlights look. They left. We were both pretty shaken and couldn't for the life of us understand what had happened. As it turns out, our pilgrimage coincided with a local battle over the place of Confederate monuments lining Monument Avenue, and a new monument to black tennis star Arthur Ashe, a Virginia native, was set to be unveiled 2 months later.
At the time of our visit, the matter wasn't settled yet, and racial tension in Richmond was apparently palpable. Maybe that's what we experienced. Or maybe those young men were just angry about the monument itself. One of the most intriguing aspects of the American commemorative landscape is the presence, often on courthouse lawns alongside World War I or World War II memorials, is the presence of monuments to the Confederacy, a failed pro-slavery rebellion that rocked the United States from 1861 to 1865. The oft-cited dictum that history is written by the victors seems not to apply to the American Civil War. For were a non-native touring the American South in, say, 1950, the predominance of Confederate regalia might suggest that the rebellion had in fact been victorious. Nearly 2 years after the tragic death of George Floyd at the hands of Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin, 5 years after the deadly Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, and 7 years after Dylan Roof savagely murdered parishioners at Mother Emanuel Church in Charleston, the time has come at last, it would seem, for a national reckoning of Confederate memory, starting with monuments. The title of my paper, No More White Supremacy, comes from graffiti spray painted at the base of the Robert E. Lee Equestrian Monument in Richmond, Virginia, not long after George Floyd's death sent an already racially tense America into a fury over continued police brutality against African Americans. Black Lives Matter, one of the main activist groups, led the charge against the Confederate monuments, and their ire was drawn immediately to that most famous, seemingly untouchable vestige of Confederate memory, perched high above Richmond's Monument Avenue, and which had come to embody all that was malignant about the lost cause narrative of Confederate history. Over the next few minutes, I propose to examine the current reckoning of Confederate monuments by placing it in proper historical context. Looking back, their story is not pretty, and there are definite winners and losers, Thus, in order to understand the importance of the present to the efforts of Black Lives Matter, for instance, at taking them down, we must first appreciate where they came from and why. The Confederate monuments that dot the American South are not innocuous remnants of a once glorious civilization. They came into existence not too long ago for a sole purpose: to promote a fictionalized version of Confederate history, also known as the lost cause of the Confederacy. But, despite their bases of cement, their stories are not written in stone. Indeed, the history of America's Confederate monuments is not static, nor has their existence been without criticism from those most psychologically affected by their simple presence, African Americans. In May 1890, the years-long fundraising and logistical efforts of the Lee Monument Association came to fruition when, before a crowd of thousands, the Robert E. Lee statue was finally unveiled. The project was not alone, far from it, for since the American Civil War had ended 25 years before, ladies' memorial associations and other groups had funded efforts to commemorate the Confederacy, first as sober memorials for battlefield deaths, and then, over time, as something much more political. At the heart of the latter was a complete reimagining of the reasons for secession and the causes of the Civil War. In a phrase borrowed from a new history of the Civil War by Richmond newspaper editor Edward Pollard, the lost cause quickly took shape as the vivid memory of the war obscured with time. In this resolutely pro-Confederate version of secession and Civil War, slavery was pushed to the periphery, displaced by supposed states' rights. The cause had in fact been noble, and defeat on the battlefield was simply due to the superior means of the United States Army. General Lee, as well as Confederate President Jefferson Davis and General Stonewall Jackson, became sacrosanct figures, akin to Confederate saints, as the lost cause transformed Confederate defeat into an ideological victory. The Confederate veteran, alongside his fallen comrades, became venerated, as did the wives, mothers, and daughters, who had made great personal sacrifices defending their homes from the immoral Yankee invader. It must be remembered that the lost cause was taking shape and gaining momentum politically, just as civil rights victories passed in the wake of the Civil War were being dismantled across the South. Many white Southerners did not take lightly the imposition of black equality on their society, whose way of life, they said, depended on white supremacy. The status quo had been upheld during the antebellum years, but now slavery no longer existed, and African Americans had new rights as citizens. In many ways, the lost cause was a means for angry whites to find common ground in their fight against what they deemed to be the evils of Reconstruction. Fittingly, to right a perceived wrong, those who died in the war needed remembrance, and efforts began in earnest to elevate them atop the pedestals they deserved. The first Confederate monuments were very sober. Indeed, they were, in many regards, funerary, sculpted in the form of steles or obelisks. Their placement was, for us today, not what we're used to. They were typically erected in cemeteries and served as beacons for commemoration ceremonies, the most important of which was by far Confederate Memorial Day, an official holiday in the former Confederacy falling sometime in May. Processions were led by ladies' memorial associations, veterans associations, and auxiliaries, and they were mournful in appearance and tone. Little by little, however, Confederate monuments started to move from cemeteries to town centers, as redeemed rebels and their allies reclaimed positions of political power in the South. Symbolically, the move was huge. It meant that no longer were these statues simply reserved for mourning. They suddenly became places of celebration. Some, like the Robert E. Lee and Jefferson Davis monuments in Richmond, were incredibly expensive and ostentatious. Others, costly, yes, but mass-produced, sprang up on courthouse lawns and town squares across the South. Others still were highly political endeavors. such as the Confederate Monument in Arlington National Cemetery, which was unveiled by President Woodrow Wilson, the first Southerner in the White House since the end of the Civil War, in 1914. Central to the Lost Cause monument building project was one group in particular, the United Daughters of the Confederacy, the UDC. You can see on the left is the unveiling of the monument at Arlington Cemetery. Officially founded in 1894 in Tennessee, the UDC was comprised of elite white women, descendants of Confederate veterans, whose principal aims were to promote the Confederate cause and to perpetuate a positive version of Confederate history. To do this, the UDC had a multifaceted approach. First, organizationally, the UDC was structured in a fashion similar to veterans organizations, a national board and state chapters, which further fanned out into hundreds of local chapters, including the youth auxiliary group, the Children of the Confederacy. The UDC set about creating a Confederate liturgy with UDC-approved school textbooks and library reading lists containing only those books whose contents upheld the values dictated by the Lost Cause narrative. Additionally, the UDC made sure that Confederate flags and portraits of Lee or Davis were present in classrooms across the former Confederacy. At nearly 100,000 members by the time of the Great War, the UDC wielded considerable political power in the South. That power was essential for the other major prong of the program, redesigning the memorial landscape of the South and beyond in the image of the Lost Cause. And this is where the UDC's role in our discussion today comes into play. State and local chapters, later in conjunction with other groups, like the Sons of Confederate Veterans, who took the lead after the Second World War, led massive fundraising efforts to memorialize the Confederacy. At state and local levels, funds were at least matched in part by governments. Likewise, public spaces, taxpayer funded, of course, were allotted to the erection of UDC monuments. Many of the cemeteries that were home to the first generation of Confederate monuments were private. Starting after the end of Reconstruction, however, the paradigm shifted, and the Lost Cause was pulled into the public sphere. These are the monuments that have made international headlines, especially since the Charleston Massacre in 2015. The reasons for the growing backlash are numerous. The terrible events mentioned earlier merely served as catalysts that brought national attention to the monuments. The Southern Poverty Law Center, in data released in the wake of the Charleston shooting, estimated that there were more than 1,000 Confederate memorials in the American South, several hundred of which were monuments, often strategically situated on courthouse lawns or other sites representing public power. Confederate monuments were a logical target of grassroots groups like Black Lives Matter. For generations, Black Southerners were forced to walk beneath the shadow of a bronze Confederate soldier anytime they had official business to attend to. Getting a marriage license, signing a deed, trying to register to vote, going to court, or paying taxes. It wasn't until the Nixon era that segregation finally fell in the South, and Jim Crow had, since the end of Reconstruction, prevented African Americans from voting, let alone holding any public office. If the KKK and lynching weren't deterrents enough, the Wilmington, North Carolina coup d'etat in 1898 showed how far white supremacists would go politically to keep Black citizens out of office. Consequently, in discussions of Confederate monuments on public land, funded at least in part by taxpayer money, it should not be forgotten that Black taxpayers' voices and opinions never entered into the equation. In this era of renewed battles over Black voting rights, it seems all the more reasonable that civil rights-minded groups concentrate at least a portion of their energy to Confederate monuments, which stand as a reminder to the white and Black populations of the South of who is actually in control. Questions of gerrymandering, congressional redistricting, and voter list suppressions, most recently since the 2020 elections, have made the presence of these white supremacist icons even more problematic. But there does seem to be some light at the end of the proverbial tunnel. Over the past few years, a number of Confederate memorials, including dozens of statues, have been removed from public spaces, including some of the most prominent. Monument removals in New Orleans, Charleston, Louisville, Baltimore, and St. Louis made headlines, of course, but none have matched the symbolism of the removal of the Confederate monuments of Richmond's Monument Avenue, starting with Jefferson Davis in June of 2020 and ending with the two-stage disassembly of the Robert E. Lee statue in September of 2021. Sadly, again, the catalyst for each of these waves of monument removal was a brutal act of racial violence. Fortunately, however, groups of angry citizens managed to rally together around the same common cause for civil rights and hold white supremacy, at the heart of which, in the American South, is the lost cause, accountable. Preparing this paper has brought back the memory of those men in Richmond in 1996. They understood the role of the Lee Monument, if my friend and I didn't. In closing my portion of this discussion, I feel that we need to bring our focus back to why Confederate monuments in particular have often been the sites of Black Lives Matter protests. It boils down to history. Whose history and to what end? Don't be fooled. Confederate monuments do teach history. They teach white people's history, or Black people's history, by omission. In other words, they teach the history of white supremacy, and Black people have known it from the beginning. Thank you very much.